Sandra Alberti is the Director of State and District Partnerships and Professional Development for Student Achievement Partners. Sandra joined Student Achievement Partners in the New Jersey Department of Education, where she served as the Director of Academic Standards and as the Director of Math and Science Education. In these roles, Sandra was directly involved in state standards, assessment, and professional development policy and implementation strategies. Prior to working at that state level, Sandra had several district-level positions, including school superintendent. And I hear they get a little picky about how many seats there are in the auditorium. Assistant superintendent of teaching and learning, principal, subject area supervisor, and what I like best, high school science teacher. That's what I did. She holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Rutgers University and a master's and a doctorate's degree in educational leadership from Rowan University. Student Achievement Partners was founded by David Coleman, Susan Pimentel, and Jason Zimba. Lead writers of the Common Core State Standards, and the organization is a nonprofit organization with one purpose: to help all students and teachers see their hard work lead to greater student achievement. So please welcome Sandra Alberti.
I will also echo the appreciation and admiration for you all being here on a Saturday morning. It is interesting work that we're here to talk about, exciting work, and whether you're here as a teacher, a parent member, a community representative in support or in opposition, I thank you for taking the time out of your Saturday to learn more about this work. And I am excited to kind of share with you my perspective, where I come from, to this work, and hopefully help clarify. And I know we have a panel set up later to ask questions and answer questions, and I'm looking forward to doing that with all of you here today. We should talk about what standards are, what is the same about having standards now versus with the standards we've had over the 20 years, and why this is getting so much attention, and people are really talking about this as part of a reform movement when we've had standards for 20 years and it didn't really do much in the world of reforming education. And so standards are, as it was mentioned in the video, goals. The outcome expectations that we hold for our students. What made these standards different, one of the things that makes these standards different than the standards that preceded them, is that they are much fewer in number. Fewer in number meaning we do expect these outcomes for all kids. Connecticut, like New Jersey, like most states in the country that had standards before this, and the teachers who are in the room who taught before and who are teaching now, know it wasn't unusual to have over 100 standards in a grade in a subject. It was just an impossible thing to say, and these are my goals for my kids in my class this year, because it was an impossible thing to think that we could achieve that many goals for all the kids in our class. So when the effort came about to design these standards to really drive education, what we decided to do is, and we collectively meaning everybody who participated in this process, from the lead writers to the feedback groups to the people that gave input to the process, that these had to be standards that signaled not just what we wanted to do to keep kids busy for 13 years of public education, but what does research evidence tell us kids need to be successful? So we started off by saying, for the first time in our lives of education, we need to start by being honest about time. There's lots of things that we could say are nice to do, nice to spend our time on, but what if we gave parents, kids, teachers a signal to say, these are the things that would actually help prepare kids for the next things that they need to do and the next things that they needed to do. So that was the first part of this process, is to get to a set of standards that were fewer in number so that we could indeed focus on what pays off best for kids going forward. And so these standards are just the outcomes. It's interesting, I have a lot of different versions of my bio, and the one that I like best ends with the fact that, okay, I've done all these jobs and I have these degrees, but really, I'm the daughter of a public school teacher who decided that this is going to be her last year of teaching. My mom's retiring this year. And 2 elementary age children third grade and fifth grade this year that really keep this real for me every day. And so what this means for their experiences and so on is really important, and wanted to just kind of share with you a bit of context around the standards, what we hope for them, from them. But one of the things that I use often in my talking about my kids and my mom is specific examples, because I think that really helps. So when we talk about standards, just to make it real about what this means, there is a standard in the Common Core State Standards that says by the end of third grade, all children will be able to fluently multiply within 100. That's what the standard is. Now, if I think my two daughters are going to learn that the same way, I know that's not true. 2 classrooms within a school district, not every kid is going to learn it the same way. So the job of teachers, the job of schools, boards of education, curriculum designers, and so on, is to figure out how are we going to get all kids there. And so that's part of what these standards are, just dictating those outcome expectations that are the minimum, and then going forward. So hinting at a few things we'll talk about, and so I'd like to just get through some of the content and help you understand what the big changes are. I felt like for this particular gathering, what would be most helpful, hopefully I kind of got that right, is to talk a bit about what are the changes that we're going to see, what they're going to look like, why are we making these changes, and then kind of talk about some things that we can do with our students at home and so on to help in this effort. So at Student Achievement Partners, which Steve mentioned in the introduction, nonprofit, we have nothing to sell. We don't. I don't take speaking fees. I didn't take money for being here today. We are nonprofit. We know a lot about the standards. So the people who kind of led the authoring of the standards founded our organization. So we know there's very little that we need to guess at interpretation because we can go directly to the source. So one of the things that we think is very helpful in understanding the standards is to start off with these kind of big picture messages, this big picture change of what's different about these standards. And we have really worked on how to talk about this, how to get people to understand the standards through this framework of talking about 3 big shifts are happening in literacy instruction and 3 big shifts are happening in mathematics. And there is more to the standards than this, but if you understand these things, you're going to have a great preview into what your children's education will look like, into what Smarter Balance assessments are going to start looking like, because it is part of one and the same. So this I kind of talk about as understanding the forest from the trees. And so understanding this isn't everything, but it gets you a lot. So the first thing that's changing with the Common Core State Standards in comparison to typical standards that preceded them, as I mentioned before, we started off by thinking about what do kids need, using evidence, what do kids need to be successful in work, in college, in adult life going forward. And one of the things that we know over time is that we have almost in every state across the country expanded how much time we spend in elementary schools with kids reading. So I know in my own kids' schools, we have these 90-minute literacy blocks. You probably have them in your schools in Connecticut also. And there has never been a more sacred section of time in school than that. I mean, I think in my kids' school, they're not even allowed to use the bathroom during the literacy block. It is like that sacred. You're never allowed to do early dismissals during the literacy block. And that has had some really good results. And so we know from national assessments, our early elementary literacy rates are increasing. We have more attention paid on this. But what we also know, and if I think back to my time as a principal or talking to my third grade teacher mother, we don't have the time that we used to have to teach science, to teach social studies, because so much of what we're focusing on is in this literacy block. And when we look at what kids are reading in this literacy block across the country, about 70% of what they have been reading is fictional stories. And so if you think about our youngest learners coming in, not having access to science and social studies, which I kind of call learning about the world around them, what we're asking to happen in the first shift of these standards is that we start balancing that. So about half of what students are reading remains fiction, and about half of what they're reading should start being nonfiction, because it turns out that it's different to read nonfiction. It's a different skill set than to read fiction. So in elementary school, it's about 50-50. Kids are reading fiction and reading nonfiction. But I want to make sure to point out, particularly for the teachers in the room, is that we're not just reading to read. Oh, Thursday, today's a nonfiction day. What we want kids to start learning how to do, because they do need to learn how to do this, is to read a piece of nonfiction as a source of information. So in order to build knowledge, you can learn about any topic in science, you can learn about any period of history, any place in the world, through text. And so that's the skill that goes along with, don't just give kids nonfiction text to read, but actually help them learn that text can be a source of information. So elementary school, that looks like about 50-50. When kids get to middle school and high school, these standards aren't just for the English classrooms. They're for science classrooms, social studies classrooms. This idea of literacy isn't just for the English teachers. So when I think back to my former job as a science teacher, I will admit to you, and it will become clear over the next hour, that I love lecturing. I do. It is Saturday morning. I drove almost 4 hours to get, and I love lecturing. Give me an audience, and I'll do it. But that's not the best way to prepare kids, because I cannot follow my students everywhere they go. And as a former science teacher, I also loved, and I know my students loved, hands-on learning. But it turns out, even if you interview scientists, they spend about 75% of their time reading and writing. And as a science teacher, I need to teach my science students how to read science, how to write about science. That's not the English teacher's job. That's my job as a science teacher. Similarly, in social studies classes, reading primary source documents, all the things that you can do in social studies, whether you're reading, some of the founding documents of this country, whether you're reading, first person accounts of things that happened, that's the kind of reading that happens in the content areas. And so when you think about what happens in reading in English classrooms, in middle school and high school, that will continue to be primarily literature rather. So the things that you may have heard about and that people are kind of writing about, oh my gosh, we're getting rid of the classics of American literature, that just isn't true. And in fact, I'll go one step further as, obviously engaged parents, teachers, community members who are here. The idea of selecting what your kids read, that process has not changed as a result of the standards. We had standards before in Connecticut, you have standards now, and so whatever process you went through to approve textbooks, book lists, and all of that, that remains. And so other than saying that kids have to read some of the founding documents of this country, The Great Conversation, I think it says a play by Shakespeare, there is very little that the Common Core says all kids must learn. So that's the first of these three shifts, and we'll go through some examples of this. The second one is very amusing to me. And it says that when we ask kids to do something in response to text, talk about it, write about it, we should actually ask them to do something that requires that they read the text. You would be surprised at how often this does not happen. And it's very easy to identify, and I am so proud that even my children can identify it. So they'll come home. My daughter in 5th grade just about a month ago came home and said, Mom, here's what I have to write about. And it said, you just finished reading a story, a passage, I guess, in their book that was called Dinner for 200, in which the characters faced major challenges in preparing a dinner for 200. Have you ever had to deal with a personal challenge, and what was that like? So now, I'm sure we could all answer that question. Have you dealt with a personal challenge, and what was that like? I don't know how many of us read Dinner for 200. My daughter's in 5th grade, so she still thinks she had to read Dinner for 200. Pretty soon they find out that you didn't have to read Dinner for 200, and you can still do pretty good on that assignment. And so what this shift is asking us to do is actually ask kids to use the text that they are reading when they are responding to it. So you may have heard, and I'm sure you'll hear when you hear about some of the specifics around the Smarter Balanced Assessment coming up, this need for kids to be able to use evidence. Gosh, if you think about real-world college and career readiness, go ahead, make an argument, have an opinion, take a position, back it up with some evidence from what you read. And that's what this second shift is asking students to do. The third of the three shifts that the standards require is that we start looking not just at the skills of literacy, what kids do, identifying main ideas, talking about characters, but it turns out the evidence tells us it's really important that we pay attention to the difficulty level of what kids are reading. So this idea of reading on grade level text is really important. What we found out when we looked at how many kids, for example, go to college and end up in remedial courses, the difficulty level of what they have to read in those 2-year colleges, 4-year college, technical schools, trade schools, is as much as 4 years ahead of what they typically are reading in high school. And so we know when kids are left to their own choices, we also have research to support, when kids are left up to their own choices about what to read, tops out at about a 5th grade level of what they individually select to read. And so we need to start giving kids practice in what it means to read more complex text. And we talk about complex text, it involves things like how long the sentences are, what the vocabulary is in those texts, as well as, some other nuances of, dialects and all kinds of things, and there are formulas out there that specify how difficult the text is. And why this is a big shift is because typically before the standards, we just wanted kids to be reading. And you know what? If you struggled in vocabulary and you struggled with dealing with complex sentences, we were just going to give you things to read that didn't have the vocabulary, didn't have those complex sentences, so you could keep reading. And so what we're asking for in this third shift in the standards is that we start paying attention to teaching kids how to read things that are on grade level. And that takes instruction, and that takes scaffolding, and all kinds of things. But if we're imagining kids graduating 12th grade, college and career ready, what we know is we have to start paying attention to what they're reading. And so, thinking about that picture of a staircase, they're getting ready for graduation and the requirements that will be put upon them after graduation. So to go through some specific examples about why, and I think maybe I covered some of these already. The first shift before Common Core, a lot of reading was fiction. Most texts came in this form of novels and short stories. But we all know as adults, most of what we have to read is nonfiction. And it's a different skill set. So we need to start helping kids learn how to read nonfiction and read it as a source of information. So I mentioned to you what the balances are, and this is kind of, it's in the standards and it's built this way because this is what's on the national assessment, and people ask me all the time, so for those of you who are teachers in the room, so how do you count 45%? Page numbers, minutes of instruction? It's a relative balance that we're talking about. It's not, to the 100th decimal point of counting. It's just relative balance. And so when you get to high school and you see 70% nonfiction and 30% literature, please understand that that includes science, social studies, reading across the curriculum and so on, but a different kind of reading across the curriculum than we've talked about over the years. So this isn't, okay, I'm a science teacher, we're gonna read in my class to help out the test scores, to help our friends in the English department out. This is about teaching kids how to read in the content areas so that they learn the content better. And so the second shift, the before, when we talk about reading, writing grounded in evidence, as I said, a lot of times we ask kids, and I could spend 90 minutes talking about stories about not requiring this. So here's another example, very typical. Bud felt lonely after his friend ran away. When was the time you felt lonely? Because one of the things that we've kind of been obsessed with in writing is this idea of engaging students. So we ask them things that we think they'd be interested in writing about, and as teachers, we might be interested in reading about it. But it turns out our experiences in working with students is that they actually like kind of going back to the text, answering questions that help them figure out what the text means. So again, as I mentioned already, we don't have to go over this in the slide because I previewed, probably in a bit too much detail already, that this is different. This is different than what we've been expecting kids to do. And once kids start figuring out that they don't need to read the text, particularly when you remember what I said earlier, in which we're going to ask kids to read things that are probably more challenging than what we've asked them to read before, if there is an option for them not to read it, you can bet that they're going to take that option. So with the things that we're asking kids to do, we should always be asking ourselves, did they actually understand the text? So, even if we're talking, and please don't think that I'm like this harsh, whip cracker, but even if you're talking about kindergarten kids, really? You want them using evidence from the text when they're reading stories? Like, you can imagine, I can, a group of kindergarten kids sitting around a carpet reading, with their teacher like they always have, and the teacher might say to them, what do you think is going to happen next? And just simply ask the question, what did you hear in the story that made you think that? It's not like, on what page did you find it? No, it's like really having conversation about the text. It's okay to say, what did you think about that? And why did you think it? It's an interesting thing. It's not a one answer. It's not a low-level rote memorization, kick it out kind of a thing, but it's discussing the text, which kids have told us in the examples that we've used with lots of kids across the country, that they actually get that, and they actually enjoy it. They learn more about the text, and it becomes a much more active process for them. So, some examples. We already went that. So the text-dependent questions, you're looking at the one that why did he feel lonely? Just to give the contrast, what did Bud do and say in his text to show that he was lonely? You see the difference there? So you would actually have to know whether kids read the text, if they can use the text in doing that answer, but it's not text-dependent in that it asks you, how many words are in sentence number 5. That's not the kind of text-dependent. So to give you some other examples, I'll skip to the one in the middle because I think it's such a great example. One of the things that is part of this kind of the great conversation of this country that we encourage to be included in the reading samples is Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And it is pretty much read in many, many high schools across the country. And probably the most typical question that students are asked to respond to after reading Letter from a Birmingham Jail is the one that's posted on the left. In Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Dr. King discusses nonviolent protest. Discuss in writing a time when you wanted to fight against something you felt was unfair. Because what kid doesn't want to write that essay, and what teacher doesn't want to read it? That is interesting. But that is a pretty challenging text. And I can just picture, I will admit having been a nerd in high school, but I think this isn't atypical for kids. I would have read that text. I would have thought about it. I would have maybe talked to some other people about it, and there were other kids in the class who probably didn't read it. We both have an equal shot at doing well in response to that question. That's not fair. That's not right. But getting kids to discuss the question, getting them to discuss the text is the job that we want. That's why we do this. And so it's very different than the question that is a text-dependent question, which says, what can you infer from King's letter about the letter he received? And for all of us who have probably read that letter, you probably need to read it one more time to be able to answer that question. That's why this is part of learning how to read, learning how to respond to text, because you actually need to read the text. I remember, I think, the kinds of questions that I had to do on standardized tests when it came to reading comprehension, and maybe a lot of you had the same experience, which it was, read this short passage, now close your book and answer these questions. Do you remember that? So that was like, can you memorize what you read? And I remember, as most of us probably did in middle school and high school, when are we ever going to need to do that? Like, really, this is not that. Text-dependent means you want to answer the questions? Look at the text. Take a look. The questions that you'll see on the Smarter Balanced Assessment are going to require kids not just to read something and then write an unrelated but kind of, in response to, but actually use evidence from what they've read in order to make their response. And so this is much more college and career ready, much more indicative of whether kids understood the text than the things that kids are typically doing now. The third of these, again, I already mentioned that most of what kids are reading, given their own choice, tops out at a 5th grade level. And that isn't really what it takes to get them ready for the challenges, whether it's reading a journal article in a 2-year college, reading a training manual, reading a college textbook, whatever it is that they're reading, this isn't going to get them ready. And so when students move toward college, they need to get ready. And I know that these PowerPoint slides will be available to you, so please don't feel like I'm skipping too quickly through them. Want to make sure that you guys have enough examples here for this. So after Common Core, we're imagining this staircase. Now, let me just say one thing, because I could kind of guess that this doesn't necessarily always fall well. When I say all students, I don't forget that we have students with disabilities. I don't forget that we have English language learners. I don't forget any of that. These are the goals that we hold for all students. That is true. What it's going to take to get all students there is a lot of work and a lot of focus and a lot of attention. So that's one part of the equation, is that the scaffolds and supports that kids need will be different, but we have a different set of goals. I also want to remind us that there are kids who will go well beyond these standards, who will go further than on-grade level text, and that the standards do not limit that either. So what the standards indicate for us is what is the focus of our energy, what do we want for all students, but that's going to require some scaffolding and transition to get there for kids who are already struggling, and it's also going to need for us to go in different places for students who are ready to move beyond that, but not instead of that. Okay, so let's talk about math, and so I'll do a better job of not like giving all of the answers before we get to the examples in math. In literacy, we then have three big shifts. The first one, this idea of we need to read more nonfiction. The second one, kids need to do a better job and be asked more often to use evidence in responding to text, whether they're speaking, writing, what have you. And the third is that kids need to read more complex things. They need to start learning how to read things that are at their grade level, with whatever supports that takes, so that they can get independent in doing that. Colleagues of mine might say those in a different order. You might, as is a natural tendency to do, to say, which one should we do first? Is there, a sequence to these things? And in literacy, I would tell you, it doesn't really matter. Different people talk about them in different ways. Some districts are kind of doing all three of these things at once. Others are taking it, let's do the text-dependent questions first, and then we'll look at what kids are reading after that. And there's really no right or wrong answer with that. Very different story than when we talk about math. And so our precondition before Common Core in math, and we probably all grew up in this system, was a math education in this country which was described as a mile wide and an inch deep. Have you heard of that description before? So, doing this job with my kids in early elementary math, it is mind-blowing how we have had a math curriculum in this country, education system in this country, which I will tell you from my individual opinion, is built on believing kids can't do math. So, when my older daughter, who's now in 5th grade, was in 3rd grade, and I went to back to school, and by the way, I'm pretty anonymous in my district. They do not know what I do for a living. Otherwise, no one would ever talk to me. If the 3rd grade teacher one more time said to the parents, math is tricky. 3rd grade math, it is really tricky this year. We'll get through it. We'll do it. But it is real. Like, can you imagine kids believing that they should know this, can know this? It is interesting. When my mother, before I started this work, she was a 5th grade teacher, and I encouraged her to go to 3rd grade because it's my favorite grade. I think for people who love math, and she loves math, it's a great place to start. It's where kids learn about fractions for the first time and multiplication and division. It's so exciting for us. And I remember she asked me, Sandra, do you think it's okay if at back to school night I tell the parents that the kids are going to need to know their multiplication facts? I said, I don't know. Are you going to tell them they need to know the alphabet too? Yes, it is okay. It is what they need to know in order to be able to be fluent in reading. You need certain skills of, knowing the letters and the sounds and decoding and all that. And to be fluent in math, there's certain things you need to know. When I started this job, I was invited to a retirement dinner of one of my former colleagues who was a physics teacher at the high school, and so it was all my old, high school science teacher buddies. And I remember telling the physics teachers, guess what? The Common Core requires kids to know their multiplication facts from memory. You would have thought I gave these science teachers a golden lottery ticket. They're like, are you kidding me? You mean we can start talking about physics without kids reaching for the calculator for every little thing? Really, that is what is required. And the way we get there is by having a very different system. Again, grounded in evidence for what kids need. So let's go through these, and I won't give away the story before we start. So the first shift, and this has to be the first shift. So in literacy, I said that didn't really matter. The first shift in math does matter. It has to be first that we get to this idea of focus. And so what focus means is go deeper on fewer things, but we need to get away from this mile-wide, inch-deep curriculum. And so to get to focus, I mean, a lot of people had this idea before Common Core, but politically it was just too hard. The books weren't focused, the districts next door to us weren't focused, the states weren't focused, the testing wasn't focused. But what focus literally means is we take a look at what kids need to know, K-12, we kind of build this progression about what do you need to know here before you can learn that, before you can learn that, and really help so that kids, teachers, have the ability to support kids who don't understand the math. Not to say it's tricky, we're moving on, you know, we're keeping it going. When my mom started teaching 3rd grade, and I do divulge into family stories a lot, I remember she told me the first time she had to introduce her 3rd graders to fractions. You know, the denominator, the numerator, and her kids were struggling. They didn't understand what she was talking about. So she did, to my heart's content, what all good teachers should do, and so she consulted her 3rd grade team. My gosh, I did this lesson, and it was pretty clear to me that the kids didn't understand what I was talking about. And the response she got from her veteran 3rd grade teammates was, don't worry. We only touch fractions in 3rd grade. They'll learn it again next year. Don't worry about it. And that's really the kind of math education we've set up. We touch on something, but we don't expect kids to master it. And then we show it to them again the next year. And sometime, someone's going to decide to tell them they have to know this, but chances are by then we've moved well deeper, well beyond those expectations. So this is very different. And so the idea is that what we have been doing is literally covering lots and lots and lots and lots of topics in a year. When I started this, and my daughter was in 3rd grade, in the month of January, I asked, you know, she brought home her math homework every night, and I took a picture of it. And I scanned it, and I made a slideshow of what we were doing every night, like counting cupcakes on Monday, and plotting points on a coordinate grid on Tuesday, learning how to tell time on Wednesday, and it was just nuts. It was just, it was funny, it was entertaining. I think I did a presentation in Norwalk a couple of years ago, and I remember showing this, and, you know, people were like, gosh, I'm glad my kid, I'm not your kid's teacher. I was like, but imagine if I was. What is the story that you would tell your parents that you are focusing on in math this year? So this seems like, maybe for parents, an interesting, easy idea. Like, get good at doing fewer things. That's what this message is about. But I will tell you that most of what we're observing across the country is that we're not doing that. We're afraid to stop doing the things that aren't in the standards so that kids can get better. But when you start seeing what homework is going to look like, how much time your kids are spending on particular concepts, that will look different because we're actually building confidence in math. We want kids to say, I know this, I know I can do it, you can ask it to me in any number of ways, and we will go on with math. And so, more than, this is a research piece that supports this. We look a lot at international assessments. I don't know if your communities do, the people who worked on the standards did, and when we look at those high-performing countries, oftentimes we think, well, you know those kids go to school 6 days a week. You know those parents really, really get on them about learning this math. But turns out when you look at the curriculum in these high-performing countries and you compare it to the curriculum that we have in this country, we have much, much more covered in our curriculum than they have. So one of the assessments that we look at often is this TIMSS test. It's an international math and science test. Hong Kong as a comparison country, which is convenient because most of their materials are in English, and they usually perform 1, 2, or 3. They omit as much as 50% of the topics that are on that test is not even in their curriculum. The United States covers more of that curriculum, I didn't say teach, right? Covers more of that curriculum than any other country does. And if you haven't read those headlines, we're going down further and further on those scales as we go on. And so we can talk about other things that make our countries different, and I get all that, and that is all true. But it's certainly an issue that our kids do more covering and not understanding math than they do in other countries. That is true. And so when I think about whether it was my, experiences as a science teacher, whether it was my experiences, kind of working with kids struggling when I was an elementary school principal, I can just hear it. And for those of you who are parents or teachers, well, that looks different than the way it looked on the homework. Like, is this extra credit? I don't understand this form of a question. Like, that is because we're not teaching the kids math. We're teaching them how to get the answers. And as teachers, no fault of ours. We have that much in our curriculum. So when our job is to cover 100 standards in a year, the way we do that is figure out quick and easy ways to get kids to get the answer right. And it turns out understanding math takes time. We don't have time. And so what we've done is built this system where we just kind of, one of our, actually new colleague of ours that just joined our team is a teacher from Norwalk. And she was 4th grade teacher, and she, called this, in this country we have the spray and pray method of teaching math. We just spray kids with everything and pray that some of it will stick. And so this is what we're trying to get away from. So this is what math looked like before Common Core. Whether you were in kindergarten or all the way through 12th grade, you got a little bit of each one of these things. A little numbers and operations, a little bit of measurement and geometry, because this is easy to measure. It's easy to design tests around this. It's easy to design curriculum around this. But no matter where I speak, if I ask early elementary teachers, what is the most important concept for kindergarten through 2nd graders to learn, what do you think they would tell me? Let's test you all. Numbers and operations, for sure. Numbers and operations. But if you look at a typical early elementary curriculum, oh, I promise you it's in there. It's in there. But so is everything else. And so it's really, what do you do with the kids who are still struggling in addition when you're also trying to teach them statistics and probability, really? Like, really we're doing that when they don't quite yet understand the difference between tens and hundreds? Like, let's just kind of back up a second. And one of the philosophies that I would say motivates all of this work is to say this: teachers work really hard. Kids work really hard. None of this is a judgment against that. So what the standards are trying to help us all do is to say, what is worth working hard at for my kids? What is it? I mean, when my daughter, here I go again, was in 2nd grade, this actually turns out to be a funnier story than it was even last year. She was in 2nd grade. They were learning how to measure temperature looking at a thermometer. And I remember she had a problem that had something like, if there is something that's 18 degrees below 0 and it raises up, to 5 degrees, how much did it go up? And I happened to go to a school board meeting incognito that night, and I saw my daughter's 2nd grade teacher. And I said to her, boy, I really had a problem with the homework tonight. And she looked at me and said, you had a problem with 2nd grade math? I said, why would you ask kids to do temperatures below 0 when they don't even know what negative numbers are yet? Turns out now pretty much everybody knows what negative numbers are, thanks to our polar vortex year we're having. But it's just this kind of thinking that we don't really imagine when we think about how we get kids to understand math. So it turns out that what the Common Core State Standards is asking, or making possible, is that all kids can do math. How do we create a curriculum, a system where all kids can do math? Is that we focus on the things that really matter for kids. Boy, if kids really understand place value when they get to 3rd grade, if kids really understand addition and subtraction, I mean really understand it, they're not afraid of it. They don't dread it. They know it. How different would 3rd grade math look? How different would middle school math look, and I'll just say middle school science, if kids really understood what fractions were, proportions, rates? How different would that look if we created a system where kids aren't just exposed to these math topics year after year, but really understood it? And so in order to deliver on that, we needed to first say there is some math that is more important than other math. That was kind of an evil thing to do before, likened to the idea that we shouldn't have, and I don't, favorite children. Like, you can't say some math is more important than other math. But it is true that some math is more important than other math. Kids should know that, teachers should know that, Parents should know that, because that's where we should be spending our energy and our time. So, this is different than that other picture that we saw, where you again have K through high school, and you're building, so that you're focusing in K2 on fewer topics, and in this case, operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, understanding place value. Then you bring in fractions, and so on and so forth, so that by the time they get to middle school, they don't just take a class called algebra, they can actually do algebra, because we're setting it up that way. Here's an example before Common Core. This is first grade. 5, 8, 3, 1, and kids are supposed to kind of figure out all the numbers. Like, can you imagine giving this to kids before they even know the difference between, tens and ones, when they're still struggling? This isn't really the best use of their time. We want always to be working on understanding so that they can build on things year after year. It's interesting to me that we ask kids to calculate area before we ask them to learn how to multiply. We ask kids, my favorite, the one that my kids love, to do organized lists. I don't know how many of you have elementary school children or have taught elementary school. My daughter gets these problems. So you go to a book fair, and there are 5 different books on the shelf. How many different ways could they be arranged? So this is 3rd grade. There's actually a formula to figure that out, but you don't get to learn that in 3rd grade. In 3rd grade, this has the heading of organized lists. So she starts off and says, well, if this book was first, then we could have these books afterwards. And then if this book was first, and we fill up a whole piece of paper, and we figure this out. And I look at her, and she looks at me. I said, feel like math? Nope, doesn't feel like math. Well, just get it done. And that's what we do, because we have that bucket of saying that we need to do these kinds of studies, or we could just be working on multiplication, or we could just be getting better at understanding fractions. And so that's part of what this change is about, is that this is hard work. It's hard for teachers, it's hard for kids, and if we are going to get close to all kids being able to do this, we need to have time. It takes time. Now, one of the things that we often hear in the pushback against the math standards, interestingly, is like kind of both sides of the spectrum. One, oh my, what are we going back to old-fashioned math? Is that what we're doing here? Drills every day? Like, if any of you think that all kids are going to, for example, learn all their multiplication facts by doing drills every day, like, we would have done that a long time ago. We need lots of ways for kids to do this. We need them to have discussions, build things, and yeah, maybe do some drills, but a whole variety of things. That takes time. That takes skillful teaching. That's the work that teaching and learning is about, and that's what we're looking to do here. So the other thing that's true with the Common Core, and this is kind of a little bit in the details, is that we build from year to year of what kids learn. So it used to be, in typical standards, including Connecticut before the Common Core, there would be a standard that would just say, probably in 5th or 6th grade, kids will be able to do all operations with fractions. And it's like, well, how do you get there? All of a sudden, they can just do that? Very different than how these standards are laid out in the Common Core, which, just to kind of illustrate, in 4th grade, the thing that kids need to be able to do is multiply a fraction by a whole number. That's it. They can go beyond that if they get that really well, but that's the core expectation. So that when they get in 5th grade, they can add to that understanding and then multiply a fraction or a whole number by a fraction. And then they build on that, and they do multiplication and division of fractions by fractions. And so you see, the idea is that we attend to the way kids learn, very different than just saying, do operations with fractions. That actually didn't work for kids. And that's how we got to kind of like these mnemonics, invert and multiply, all those things that we probably remember, because we didn't attend to the understanding that takes more time. Looking at the other idea, place value, one of my favorite things to talk about, because we just do it so badly. We just do it so badly. So let's talk about the 3rd shift in math, which is an interesting one. So the first shift, we had focus. The second shift is that we want to connect concepts. We want to build kids' learning year after year. And the 3rd shift is interesting, because believe it or not, there are philosophies about math. There are wars currently being waged about math. And those wars have to do with this. There are some people who believe that kids should only learn procedures and follow kind of what we call algorithms, steps, to learn how to do math. and that's all. You don't have to understand the math, just, here's how you do it. You multiply a two-digit number by a two-digit number. You do the first one, you do the second number, you move it over by one. What does it mean to move it over by one? Don't worry about it. Just do it, and then you get the answer right, and you can get the answer right, and that's good. Accuracy is important in math. And then there are other people who say, we don't want kids just to be kind of ignorantly following procedures and processes. We actually want them to understand the math, and that's really important. And if they get the answer right or wrong, as long as they can explain it. These Common Core math standards do not take either one of those positions. So what these math standards require is three things. One, kids need to understand the concepts. That is true. That takes time. But that is part of learning math. Two, they need to have some procedural skill and fluency. They do need to know some things quickly and accurately. You should be able to pull a fifth grader aside and ask them to multiply a three-digit number by a three-digit number, and they shouldn't start crying, they shouldn't start sweating, they shouldn't start trembling. They don't need to know how to do it in their head, but if someone asks them, what is 152 multiplied by 491, they should have a strategy that they have in their pocket that they can use. That is not a problem-solving situation. And we have these kinds of fluency expectations at each grade. In kindergarten, adding and subtracting within 5. All kindergarten kids, by the end of kindergarten, they've done enough math that if you ask them what 2 plus 2 is, or 1 plus 4 is, they should be able to tell you pretty rapidly. This is the result of all the math work that they're doing, the result of focus. So that's two of the three things. One is conceptual understanding, two is this idea of skill and fluency, and the third one, and the thing that we often just kind of jump to, is this idea that students should be able to apply their math to real-world situations. So I'm sure you've all heard that before, and it's just interesting, like, is calculating, interest on a mortgage real world for third grade? I don't know, but actually applying math to real-world situations. So I will give let me just check my storytelling timing here. One last story. So here's my best story about application in math. My daughter, when she was in third grade, who's now in fifth grade, they were working on division, which is great, important, happy that she was doing it. Worksheet after worksheet came home from homework where we were working on division. She comes home, has this worksheet, and about 2/3 of the way down the paper, there was some kind of a divider bar or something, and then here was the problem. It said, there was a fire. The bell rang at 2:25. The fire truck arrived at 2:32. How much time did it take the truck to arrive to the fire? And as is typical when my daughters have a word problem, they came up to me and said, Mom, I don't get it. Can you help me out with this one? Almost every night. Well, you have to read the problem. Let's read it together. 2:25, the alarm rings, 2:37, or whatever I said. The truck gets there, how much time? Nope, still don't get it, Mom. Let's draw a picture. Alarm, 2:25. Truck, 2:37. How much time did it take? I would love to tell you things de-escalated from that point, but it was another one of those, I still don't get it. And I said, what don't you get? And she said, I don't understand how I'm supposed to use division to solve that problem. Because a lot of times when we as math teachers think about application, it's, here's a whole bunch of division problems, and now here's a word problem that has to do with division. So we think our kids are doing application. Actually, they're not. And so when we think about the third part of this math requirement, understanding, procedures, and then application, it's like the math that nobody labels for you. How do you know if you're supposed to multiply? How do you know if you're supposed to subtract? I remember when my younger daughter, we'll get her in a story, was in first grade, and her teacher thought he was doing them a favor when he gave them a little worksheet that said, anytime it says how many in all, you add. Anytime it says how many left, you subtract. That's a good teacher. He was trying to help them. But you and I know what's going to happen. There's going to be a quiz, there's going to be a test, there's going to be a real situation where it doesn't say how many in all or how many left, and she's going to have no idea what to do. And so that's what this third thing is about. And let's see how many of my slides. So here's my favorite with the place value. Can you see it from back there? You probably can recognize it because we do this in just about every school. Place value, really important, right? And so kids do this. Are they good at it? You betcha. First number goes in the first spot, second number goes in the second spot, third number goes in the third spot. You don't have to know a darn thing about place value to get this right, right? But I promise you this is in almost every math curriculum in this country. Because we feel good. Place value hard. Not my kids. They're good at it. And then you send them on to, oh, my kids ace place value. We just moved right on. And so they can do this, fine. But if they're given this kind of a problem, make true equations. 100 plus 4 tens equals what? 4 tens plus 100 equals what? If kids can do this, then you know they really do understand place value. Now, why I like showing this as a Common Core example is it didn't start off with a story. There's no paragraph of narrative here. There's no stories about farms or trucks or global warming or, it is just straight out math, but you actually have to understand the concepts to get this right. And that's the difference. And if you want to put an apple tree on it, you can. You could. And it's still Common Core. Because it requires kids to understand something that is important in math. Okay, so things that let's see, this was in that worksheet. Okay, so things that we're going to go talk about just briefly, and then I'll finish up here, and it always amazes me how much time I take to do these things. What can you do to help your children in literacy? Some suggestions that I have for you. One, bedtime story. Obviously, the things that we've already said about how important it is to read at home, read with your kids, read things that are interesting, read things that are fiction and nonfiction. It turns out we have a lot of research that says boys in particular, one of the good news pieces about this balance of fiction and nonfiction, boys are really engaged in nonfiction, and if all they're reading in school is fiction, that tends to kind of disinterest them. But we should be finding topics that they're interested in, finding things that they can read, and that's probably another bullet, and I'm jumping ahead. But ask them questions as you're reading with them at home that relate to the text. Ask them to read things that they're interested in, science articles, historical texts. Talk about it, and you'll find that they are actually quite excited about it. Now, do you want to assign your kids research? I will admit that my daughter was assigned to do a research project on Hilary Duff this weekend. I don't know if you remember her. Very few people do. It was one of the times that I did send in an email to the dear teacher, like, really, Hilary Duff? There are some other Hillarys out there actually making history right now, but we complied. But, so things that are of interest, like research things that matter to them. The idea of following directions, writing directions, following step-by-step directions to accomplish a task. Also good things that you could do at home to support literacy, and not anything necessarily new. Math, I will admit, I had a friend over the other night, and I wanted my kids to go to bed. It was 10 o'clock at night. My kids had just come home from dance, and I said, just do whatever you want in your room. And I will brag about the fact that at 10 o'clock at night, my children decided to play school. Yes, they did. They were asking each other math questions. It was great. True, but I do encourage my kids to play math games. But the math games could be as much as, I'm thinking of a number between 10 and 20. And these are the things we do in the car. All these kinds of games, rolling the dice, adding it up, how many different ways can you make 12, all of those kinds of things, really important for kids to understand and be able to do. Flashcards, kids like that. They actually do like the speed challenge, set the timer, see how they do. This idea of persevering in problem solving is very important. And I will say, whether it is something that kids are learning on the sports field, whether it's something that they're learning with a board game that seems very unrelated to education, this is one of the things when we think about, is there a role, for example, with video games and learning? You know how many times kids die in video games and keep going and going and going? Like, imagine if they could do that with schoolwork. Like, no, you didn't get this time, try again. Try again. Maybe you'll get 3 lives. This kind of teaching them about, okay, to get it wrong and do it again, rather than just being really quick to give them the answers, even if it does require you losing your patience every once in a while, very important. Ask kids to explain, how did they get that problem? Could you explain to me, when would somebody use multiplication? I will admit, having that dinner conversation with my daughter didn't go well. Other things that you can always look for. They're working on fractions. Let's say we want to double the recipe or halve the recipe. What does that mean? What does that look like? Can we draw pictures of it? So just thinking about ways that math isn't this sterile, evil topic that only some kids are good at, but it's part of just how we function in life, I think is a really important way. And so as always, I would love time for questions and answers. I have about 5 minutes, I think. No, I have half an hour. Yay! Good, good. I misread my time. I gave a presentation in St. Louis once, and I forgot to change my clock, and so I actually had an hour for questions and answers after I raced through my presentation. But are there questions and answers, things that I can answer for you about the content of the standards, what this is going to look like? I just want to make sure that we're all clear on a couple of things here. These are standards. They are standards for college and career readiness in math and in literacy. That's it. There are all kinds of things that kids need to know and be good at, other than math and literacy, in order to be successful. But that's not part of this. And in addition to this, there's lots of things going on in the world right now to improve education that aren't the standards. We'll talk about the testing. We'll talk, I don't know that we'll talk about the other reforms that are out there, but the thing that we should be focused on here with this is imagine that we now have this agenda. Imagine that we have now done enough research, talked to enough professors, talked to people in, trade programs, apprenticeships, and so on, and say, what do your students need to be successful in your programs? We have that information, and we're going to do that. So for the people who are saying, you know what, we didn't like the process, we didn't like all the, do we really want people to argue against focusing our energy on teaching the things that matter for kids? And so there's good implementation, there's bad implementation, we could talk about all of those things, but when it comes to the concepts and content of the standards itself, one of the things we know, because goodness knows there's been a lot of polling done and all of that stuff, is that teachers overwhelmingly support this work and overwhelmingly agree that raising expectations for our students is an important thing to do. And that is what is at the heart of this movement. When I came to this work, I was working on the New Jersey Department of Education, not too different, demographics than you all have here in Connecticut. And I talked to kids who were in high school and who had never been given, challenging math work to do, who had never been expected to do more, and that was a problem. They were getting ready to graduate, and they couldn't even solve a problem that, we had all these high school requirement tests and alternative tests, and I was trying to devise questions that I thought they would answer. And I remember asking these kids, okay, here's one, I'll think of a practical math question to ask them. You have to buy something that costs $350, and we're giving you a 10% discount. How much would it cost? And by the way, they were allowed to use their calculator. And I would get things like $350.10, $35,000, because we haven't expected of kids. So what this Common Core State Standards Initiative is about is really about being truthful with kids about what it is that they should be working hard at so that they could be successful for life after high school, whatever pathway they choose to go through for that. So that's, where this is coming from, and, there's a lot of discussion going on and here and other places, I know, but that's why I'm doing this work. People might be motivated by different reasons, but for me, it's about expectations that we should hold for all of our kids, and how do we create the conditions to make that happen. When it comes to the assessments, as someone who oversaw part of our assessment program in New Jersey, we have an opportunity here to create something different. I don't think anybody is fond of testing as a thing, but when we're talking about an expectation that all kids need to know something, it is part of the system. You have to actually know whether they know it. And when we talk about the assessments, and I know you'll have a great presentation later on this morning about the assessments, imagine something different than we've ever experienced or known before, which is an assessment that's worth our time, that's worth our energy, that isn't like, oh my God, power down, we are taking these tests now. I know that's what it was in New Jersey, and I'm sure in most states it wasn't seen as part of the education of kids. That is different than what we're imagining for kids, but we all hold with us like we hold with us our experiences and baggage about what our learning was like, our education was like. We hold a lot of baggage about what assessments are like. This is something totally different. So I would just ask you, when you do hear that, just to preview a little bit, to open your minds to a whole different system. Imagine an assessment system that kids looked forward to taking, that actually was engaging, interesting, meaningful to kids, rather than just like, okay, time out of education for 3 weeks so we can do these tests. That's not what we're imagining at all. So given all of that soapboxing, does anybody have any questions?
I do.
Yes?
I have two. Right now, how familiar are you with what we used to do for assessment for the CAP and CMT?
I can just speak typically to state assessments across the board, and I've talked to several Connecticut teachers and principals and so on about the testing and how it went, but I don't know to what detail.
Because on the CAP test, I'm a secondary teacher, on the CAP test for reading and writing and math and science, it asked them to use evidence. And now we're changing it to ask the kids to use evidence. It doesn't make sense. And the math test and the science test ask, how did you get your answer?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't make sense to move from something that asks you to use evidence to something that asks you to use evidence. And the second thing,
Can I just, do you want me to respond to those, each one, or?
yeah, go ahead.
Either way. So the question I'll just repeat is, the Connecticut assessment that you're using now is already expecting kids to use evidence in responding to text. It's already asking kids to explain their thinking in math, and now we're being asked to move to another assessment system that is asking kids to use evidence in responding to text and asking them to explain their thinking in math, which I think is, I'll be, from an outsider, saying that that's much better than if the reverse was true, and the opposite, that we used to ask kids to use evidence and now we're not asking them to use evidence. But one of the things that is important and engaging, and sometimes when we're in classrooms and doing our work as teachers, it's challenging to see the big picture because we are so challenged just to get our day-to-day work done. But when we can start thinking about the kinds of innovations, the kinds of best practices that we can have in this country, when so many people are focused on a common set of goals, a common set of expectations, even measurements. Like, you can show me your assessment and the results that your students get, and as a teacher in New Jersey, there's very little I can learn from that because we're using two different measuring sticks, even if we're trying to measure the same thing. So the idea that the expectations continue to be the same and there's just a new measurement, I understand, but I would, if I were a teacher, I would kind of be affirmed by that, to say, wow, all the rest of the country is struggling about changing our assessments to do this. We've been doing it in Connecticut for a while. We're in good shape. But now I can talk to so many other teachers across the country who now can talk to me about using evidence from a text that couldn't talk to me about that before. So that's my perspective, and I get that it might seem like a lot of hullabaloo to ask you to do the same thing, but I guess there's two sides to that.
The second thing is that I hope that the state and people understand that this is going to take 11 years before you have true results, because a kid who starts right now in kindergarten, you're not going to have the results of the whole thing until he gets to 11th grade. And the state's going to want results in 2 to 3 years, not understanding that a kid who has gone through only 2 or 3 years of this. So I just think that, it's just.
Yeah, I
think it's really hard for teachers. Like, we have an 11-year plan now.
Mm-hmm.
11 years, I am facing retirement. So.
Yeah.
But my evaluation is going to be based on my results from this year or next year.
Yeah.
And that kid has only been in what Common Core for 1 or 2 years.
Right. So good. As a former state employee, I'm glad that I'm not, because these are hard, challenging questions to ask and to answer. And the thing that we all need to understand, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a parent, whether you're a kid, like, let's recognize that there is a sense of urgency here. Like, I get that this is an 11-year fully formed, you've been through this kindergarten, through high school. You are in much better shape than the kid who starts this in 8th grade. That is true. But when we talk about the things that could change, I think and believe, and we've seen evidence already, that there will be improvements year after year that will just get better, but not as good as it's going to get. And so I think we're all interested in looking at this over time for sure, but I don't think we should just kind of be like closing our eyes and say, don't even talk to me about results for 11 years. Our kids are in our classrooms now, and we need to start thinking about the things that we can leverage to help them now. So part of the design of the standards, part of this whole kind of concept is this idea of focus. Few things done well right now will have impact. I don't think we need to wait 11 years to see some positive results. I think 11 years, we don't know what we're going to see as far as how good it's going to be. But I think we're going to start seeing it, and states who have been doing this work and really working hard at it are starting to see some of those results already, and it's encouraging. And so everything you said is true. A kid who's in this for 2 years is not going to have the same, positive results as 11 years. And we're all kind of in this together. Like I said, former teacher, daughter of a teacher, parent, and state official, I'll just say. It's just an interesting kind of collaboration where there's this sense of urgency in getting things done, but also a need, to make sense of this and to support you all in the very real work that has to happen. Did you have a question? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. First, I just wanted to know, is this a standard presentation that you do? I know I'm aware there's a number of YouTube videos that are online. So if I access those, I'm basically getting this presentation?
There is the core of this that is pretty similar. I rarely just speak to parent community groups, usually educators. So a lot of this rings true, but I'm happy to send you the slides and you can have access to.
Right. With that, I would ask that for every time you make a comment that there's research and evidence, I would greatly appreciate you providing the references.
Sure, and in the standards themselves, both the literacy and math standards include references and the sources by which those things were there. So you can already access that as well.
Are you aware of the Georgia study that compared Common Core with the old Georgia standards for math and literacy?
Most states have gone through similar studies. I can't say that I can cite the Georgia one specifically.
I would just, you made the case for taking out a lot of things in math. I think that's a huge mistake. And just to use two quick examples, in my mind, to not teach kids in the lower grades a concept like pi, to not teach kids prime factorization is basically a crime, in my view. Okay, we won't get into here, this is not the appropriate thing. The last, just two quick things. One is, you made the point about organized lists really not being the way to learn math. Yet you had an Arkansas mom hold in one of these YouTube videos holding up an example of a Common Core math.
I actually saw that clip. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Where she's showing that it took 108 steps.
I saw it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm sensing just a little contradiction there.
I appreciate that contradiction because I sensed it as well. So I'll respond to a couple of things. One, the concept of pi and prime factorization. Keep in mind what I said, that the standards don't outlaw anything that you would teach. So if you have a group of students that you feel should learn pi in first grade, you said, and they can do that, that's fine. But the message of the standards is not at the expense of the time that they need to learn place value addition and subtraction. And I think, I mean, I don't know your philosophy or what you would think, but I don't think you'd say teach them pi over addition, subtraction, and place value. But in addition to, there is nothing in the standards that precludes that from happening. Prime factorization, another thing, it's not an evil thing to teach, but the idea is you could teach it in addition to the standards, but not instead of the standards. And so I don't think there's contradiction between us in what you can teach versus what you can't teach. Nothing in the standards says what you can't do. It's just the minimum that everybody must do. And as far as the Arkansas mom example, I hate to kind of go into this specific thing, but I'll share with you, someone put that on my Facebook account as well, that there was this mother who said, oh my God, the Common Core standards, it's going so backwards in math. Her daughter had to solve a problem that literally said something like, you want to get to 18, go around, you need to get to the number 90, go around, there are 18 kids in the class, how many times do you have to count off to go around? And so she asked the board members, the answer, and literally said the Common Core does not require kids to know their multiplication facts. Instead, they have to solve this problem using an organized list. Now, I would ask that mother to look at the standards where it specifically says kids need to use multiplication to solve that problem, and specifically does not include organized lists. And so I just worry about people kind of thinking that she's the authority on the standards instead of looking at the standards themselves, because you could pretty much take that whole YouTube clip in her argument and not think that there's a contradiction between she and I, but there is a contradiction between what she said and is now kind of viral on YouTube and what the standards actually require. So I would encourage any and all of you who question the standards to look at the standards. Don't look at my YouTube videos. Don't look at, David Coleman's YouTube videos. Look at the standards, and that pretty much tells you a lot about what's going on. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe it's the implementation that we have problems with, and for those people who are in the classroom right now, so maybe we're sort of pushing this too quickly because our kids are now being used as guinea pigs to figure out how to implement. That's just a statement. I actually have a question. So, we know that first grade are the most important years in brain development in a child's life in terms of building vocabulary, so on and so forth. Many children enter kindergarten, ages 4 or 5, who don't have the benefits, for example, that your children and perhaps mine have had.
Mm-hmm.
So they probably are not going to enter kindergarten with the vocabulary and with some of the tools that many children might.
Right.
So if I am a kindergarten teacher and I have 30 children in my class who don't have the kind of background and enrichments that your children have, implementation, looking at the standards. As a teacher, I'm going to start being graded upon how these children do, whether these children are in my kindergarten class or my 3rd grade class. They are probably not going to progress in the same manner and abilities as your children. So I guess back to implementation, if the expectations with the standards have these steps, and my 30 children, which probably need a whole lot of extra something, and I'm all by myself with 30 kindergartners, and I have to get them up these steps when we really need to deal with major social emotional problems, when we may be really hungry when we come to school, when we may have all kinds of other problems. How do I make these kids go up these steps when they don't have vocabulary, when they haven't had an enrichment, when many of them probably don't have computers at home? I can go on, but I have watched, and even in districts where I'm talking about kids more like yours, I see kids struggling with place in kindergarten because the placement of 10 is a very, very difficult concept when you're only 4. And many kids don't get it until they're 6 or 7. And some of these children may not get it until they're older. So none of us, we are all individuals. All our children have this. Did your kids both fall at the same age?
No,
of course not. So knowing that child development is very varied, how do we get up these steps so we all are there at the same time when we graduate from high school? My contention, as you can tell, is it ain't gonna happen.
Well, these are all good points, and I don't pretend to be an early childhood expert. I'll just start with that. But the opportunity that we have, and particularly for kids who come to us, already behind, is that, we take what we had before the Common Core and compare it to what we have now. Where what we had before the Common Core is just a list of things, which quite frankly included a lot of things that are there.
Flexibility, that's what we have. As teachers, we have a lot of flexibility and a lot of other things that we could
So I would say you used flexibility, but you still had standards. And so what typically happened is that teachers just chose within that list of standards, which were only standards because everything was expected, that you decided, well, my kids are going to work on these standards, and kids in another district next door, upstate, downstate, and another, they worked on a different set of standards. And so these inequities persisted. And so what I would just suggest to you, and I don't want to sugarcoat this or make it seem like everything is easy, is to say, okay, we're dealing with vocabulary. Our kids are coming to us with a much more shallow vocabulary, and what, as an example, the Common Core State Standards gives teachers the permission to do now is to say, instead of worrying about 100 distinct things that you could do right now to keep these kindergartners busy, we know vocabulary is a really important thing, so we are now giving teachers permission to focus on the things that really matter. Not to say, hey, my kids could take 2 days to learn that. Your kids could take 2 months to learn that, and that's part of the message of the standards, why it started first with a much more focused set of expectations, so that particularly for kids who have been struggling for so long, they can now get the signal on what's most important to learn. Now, I will say, all the things with social emotional learning, all of that, absolutely. It fosters learning. It's not separate and distinct from the goals of learning. It's part of how kids learn, why they need those conditions to be fortified, fostered.
I think you missed my point. My point isn't that we may have to zero in on certain things or not. My point is that when you have a child come into your classroom who has learning, has such that even if you're only going to focus on certain things, they still aren't going to get to where you necessarily want me to get them to. Let me finish. And that asking us as teachers to only focus on certain things is probably not good for the whole child, especially in early childhood, especially in K-3 and below. Many of your standards are inappropriate for these earlier grades, and they are going to make it even more inappropriate for a teacher with 30 kids who have to teach, I don't care how few things, they still have to supposedly get these kids, when in fact, if we need a broader breadth, and we need to actually do what you don't want to do. We need more of, if a kid comes in and we see that a child actually has a strength in something, well, it may not be one of the things that we're supposed to be teaching and zeroing in on, but it may be something that this child has actually got and we can build upon. So, but the implementation is a big problem. And I don't understand why this is such a rush, why we haven't piloted this, why we don't see whether this works. Why are the kids in classrooms and children being used as guinea pigs to find out if 11th grade it's going to work?
I'll just say my position on this. One is, I think we should use kids' strengths. All of that is instruction. Standards as outcome expectations, kind of by definition, can't be field tested. What you do field test is implementation and implementation strategies. And as far as rushing, Connecticut adopted these standards over 3 years ago. And so the fact that right now people are feeling the stress and the weight of full implementation is true, but these have been on the books in Connecticut for over 3 years. And so, would 5 years be, what's that? Well, 11 for a student to be fully formed, but that's not 11 years from now, let's pull the switch and everybody's doing Common Core. 11 years means we're now in year 4, approaching year 4 of an 11-year plan, if you want to think about it that way. But none of this is supposed to be disrespectful to the work that you all do. And just the last point I'll make, 30 kids in a kindergarten class full of high-needs students never was and never will be an ideal situation under any circumstances. And let's not blame the standards for that.
So I guess my question is just, first, I'm really happy that you came 4 hours to speak to us, and I'm happy that I woke up at 6:30 in the morning, driving from Bridgeport. It was rough getting up, I'm not gonna lie. I'm like, oh, what's my life going on at 6:30 in the morning for? And I think that I'm so happy to hear all these different opinions from teachers. And as a teacher of high school level English in Bridgeport, so, you know, kind of a hot mess, right? Like, we know that our kids are coming in with lots of disadvantages, and we know that as a classroom teacher, we're asked to do all of these impossible things. And there's a lot of things that I like that I'm hearing about Common Core, and there's a lot of things that I have questions about that I'm hearing about Common Core. But I think that one of the most important things that we can do is listen to the teachers in regards to how we're going to make this happen, and make sure that we're not judging the test. Maybe we're judging the implementation. Maybe I'm upset at my district because they haven't provided any training. Maybe I'm upset at my district because they have pushed this on us and said, make this happen, and if you don't make this happen, it's your fault. And we're left flailing saying, but I don't know how, I just need some help. So my question to you is like, how do we get more teacher voice included in the rollout of Common Core? So if it's going to be successful, or if it's not going to be successful, teachers can say like, I had some buy-in with that, like I had some input in what was happening, because I know there are really great educators that like bust their humps all the time to make these things happen. And you know, like your point, I totally understand that I work with teachers like that have 30 kids in a class and they're coming in, and to your point, it's not good, no matter what. And we know like testing is not going away. You know, so if, like you said, like I taught CAT for years, it was a waste of time. Like, is this a good piece of literature? You know, tell me how you feel about this CAT, like ridiculous things. So if there's a way where we can be more competitive internationally, if there's a way that we can align our standards across the board from state to state, I think that's a positive thing. I think it deserves a chance. My question to you is, how do we get more teacher buy-in? How do we allow teachers to have avenues to say, I want to go on a committee, I want to get my staff involved, I want to have professional development. How do we do that?
Well, you know, just looking at the sponsoring organizations that brought this together, both, you know, the AFT in Connecticut, the Connecticut Education Association, there are huge efforts of teachers. I mean, it has been one of the things that we do. We work with teachers by design. We have right now about 350 teachers across the country who are kind of our advisory board, telling us what tools to make. If you go to our website, which is Achieve the Core, it is a great website, I will tell you, in a bias, but even if I wasn't biased, it just has great resources. But what I'm most proud about that makes it so good is that we listen to the direction of teachers in order to do this. I'll just give you a really simple example. We had an old website 6 months ago, and I don't know how many of you may have seen it. It was ugly, it didn't have any pictures on it, and we were like, I'll be damned if we're gonna put pictures on it, we're just gonna tell teachers what the standards are. And when we talk to teachers about it, they're like, can you just give us some sample lessons? Can you just give us some, no, we're gonna teach you about, but we had to listen to the teachers. Here's what we want, here's what we need, and once we started doing that, the work looks completely different, it's much more effective. We have a partnership with both NEA and AFT, talk to them every single month about how we can support. And so this is a time, you know, back to the question about the testing and across the country, you can find colleagues who are in similar districts to you with maybe even similar principles, similar challenges across the country right now. And whether you're using social media to do that, whether you're, you know, going through your organizations, that is part of the interesting, exciting things about being a profession. Yes, it's really hard. It's always been hard. It's challenging. But you're now part of a big effort where a lot of people are in such a similar situation to you that I don't know that I've met a single person who doesn't believe that teachers are the key to this whole initiative. So from our standpoint as an organization, I know the Department of Education, who's represented here today, as well as these, they want to hear from you and want to help you do this work. None of us think we can do this without teachers, not a single person.
I'm a fifth grade teacher, also a parent of a special needs child. The whole program, I've been involved in writing to my Congress, testifying. I even wrote items for ASPEC. My big issue is I think the Common Core is good. I think some things in it are very good, the rigor's good. But not all kids are cookie cutters. And we as teachers are implementing 2 major units We're being evaluated with a new system. We're having to write up things and pick goals based on standard-based testing that has to do with reading fluency and not about what the Common Core is about. So the whole system's being thrown at us, and there's many teachers who don't have the time or energy because we're barely treading water, keeping up with everything that's changing. But yet, my effectiveness of a teacher is going to be measured by this test. And this test is going to be given on computers to some children who don't own computers, who've never used a laptop, who have a screen this size and have to double scroll on the screen to get around the SBAC test. So as far as the country finding a standard to measure everyone, you're giving computers to kids who have them and kids that don't. You're taking a scientific situation and changing too many variables. And what it's going to do is come up with grades and scores that is going to make teachers look horrible and affect my evaluation as an educator. And I think there's just too much change in too many directions at the same time.
Yeah, and I can appreciate every one of those sentiments. I will say, not part of the standards, but certainly part of the whole initiative. And I know a lot of people are really thinking about this closely. There's a lot of conversations that are happening in many, many places every single day about, the assessments next to the standards, the evaluation of teachers next to the standards, and I think in the next few months, to come, you'll start seeing some of this actually impacting and developing. I don't have that authority or that position, but I recognize and acknowledge a lot of the points that you make and appreciate very much the involvement that you've had in all of this work, from the testing to the standards and meeting the needs of even your own children. So it's hard. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, don't worry, everything will get taken care of. It is a messy situation. I think there are many people in this country, from the classroom to the White House, who see this as a real moment in time and an opportunity. And what we don't do so well all the time is this train is, let's add this to the train, let's add this to the train, let's add this to the train, and I get the idea that we need to keep doing this. The one thing that I will, in a very naive way, tell you is all of this is based on quality implementation. It's about good teaching and good learning. And if we all kind of hopefully keep trying to focus on that and let all the rest of this noise kind of like, it's pretty tough to say, but if you're doing the job of good teaching and good learning, this is about aligning a very messy system that we've had for so long into kind of one stream. There's a lot of transitions there, but if I were, giving any advice to teachers right now, it's focus on what's most important for kids with teaching and learning, and that's what this is at its heart. The implementation is messy, in many cases lousy, but it's all to get us to a place where we have better teaching and better learning. I don't know that anybody has any other motivation in this other than that. Let me just check time, because I know we're going to have time later for a panel of questions. So I have time for one more question, I think. Parents, yes, ma'am.
A lot of the teachers, I'm a parent from what's been labeled a low-performing district. And I disagree with the teacher that says we have to accept high-stakes testing, because as a parent, I'm not going to accept it. And I think we can push back, and it's not a necessary evil as people are trying to convince us that it is. The other thing is that when you talk about comparison, you can't compare districts against districts, you can't compare states against states, you can't compare countries against countries, because it's not apples and apples. Because my district has it looks a lot different than Cromwell or Rocky Hill, okay? And the diversity in my district is very different. I come from a low-income district, and clearly you can't say that students in a low-income district can learn the same as students from a wealthy district. So what this is going to continue to do for the low-income districts and those districts that have been labeled as low-performing is it will continue to stifle those children. It is no way, there's no sense, it makes no sense how you are claiming to raise the standards when my kids and the kids in my districts can't perform at the standards we have today. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot, basically, and those districts like Hartford, New Britain, Bridgeport, you're signing yourselves up for failure if we continue to be testing our kids. Economically, nobody wants to move into my district, okay? So even economically, high-stakes testing doesn't make sense. And when you talk about being compared to Hong Kong or Shanghai, it's clear and people know that those countries don't include certain kids' test scores.
Yeah.
They don't include test scores from the migrant farm areas, for example. So how can you say that high-stakes testing is necessary, comparison is necessary? Competition is not required in the early grades. What you're doing at that point is telling kids, you're telling my kids they are less than. And that's what they're going to believe at a young age, that they are less than, and they cannot compare to those white districts.
Thanks, and I appreciate all of the sentiment in that, and the emotion, and, you know, having worked in a lot of those districts with teachers who struggle every day to get their kids to do this work. It's a shift. We used to have an education system that had no testing at all, that, you know, kids graduated and, you know, I talked to a woman who worked really hard in an alternative school in Trenton, New Jersey, with kids that nobody thought should be in school, nobody thought they should finish, and these kids did everything she asked them to do. She had one student in particular who graduated and went on to the police academy, and came to her a week after graduation. She couldn't believe he was back in school, and he said to her, I need you to help me get into the police academy. And she said, what do you mean? He said, I can't read. She goes, what do you mean? You've been in my class for 3 years. You got a diploma. But here's a system where we didn't have tests. The kid just kind of complied and did what they needed. So there's bad sides to not having testing either. I think we need to think about how these tests are going to be used. I think we need to think about what information we're going to get. Most interested in how we promote individual student growth through a system. It's not for parents to worry about necessarily about how your district performs next to another district. That's kind of a different agenda, but how your kid does year after year is got to be what's most important to you. But we need to give you information about that too, information that you can believe in as a parent, that you know your kid, and so that's part of this larger system. I will never talk about testing as a necessary evil. Our time is too precious, our energy is too precious. If that's all testing is, I would be behind you on that. And so the opportunity that I would ask you all to think about now is, what if we did have an assessment system that gave all of us useful information? Not how you do compared to next door, but how close are your kids to being ready for the demands that the world is going to put on them. And that's part of, not all of, but part of what this assessment system is hoping to be able to do for all of you. So I know this is tough.
Can I make one last point?
Quickly, yes, and then we're going to transition.
Really quick, I promise.
These tests are to guarantee that our teachers have the same expectations, whether our students are in New Britain, or Hartford, or Bridgeport, or Westport, or Farmington. They're not saying that your students are worse because you're in a worse district. What we're saying is we need to give those districts more funding. The way we figure out funding is to figure out what districts we need. So we're saying that those students that are in Hartford, that are like struggling, that come in with income inequality, which is a fact of our lives, nothing to do with what we do in school, it's a fact of life, right? We're saying that we need to have the same expectations that you can do this in the 5th grade as any other student. That's all that this is saying.
Yeah, and I'll just close with just one phrase I want everybody to think about, is the difference between an achievement gap and an expectation gap. That I just want people to kind of think about this as we struggle to get this work done, the difference between an achievement gap and an expectation gap. So, thank you.